The winter of 1875 was a beast that devoured hope and left only frozen bones at its wake. For Eliza May Thompson, orphaned and alone in a cabin nestled deep in the Colorado territories, survival was a daily war against the cold and the crushing silence. But one morning the silence was broken. A small, dark shape in the snow, a barely breathing child wrapped in the colors of the Navajo. Taking him in was a death sentence if his people found her. Letting him die was a sin her soul couldn't bear. She never imagined that her choice would bring 100 warriors to her door, led by a powerful chief who came not for blood, but with an offer that would shatter her world forever. The silence was the first thing that got to you. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful evening. It was a hungry, predatory silence that pressed in on the log walls of the cabin, searching for cracks. Eliza May Thompson, just shy of her 19th winter, had come to know its different textures. There was the heavy, muffled silence of a fresh snowfall, and the sharp, brittle silence of a sub-zero night when the very air seemed to crackle. Today it was a whispering silence, as the wind drove curtains of fine, dry snow across the valley floor, like ghosts fleeing a massacre. Her father, Robert Thompson, had called this valley Providence. He'd seen the defensible box canyon, the year-round creek that snaked through it, and the thick stands of aspen and pine, and declared it a promised land. He'd been a good man, a dreamer with calloused hands, but the Rockies didn't care for dreams. The fever had taken him first, then her mother Mary, their graves marked by 2 simple wooden crosses on the rise behind the cabin. Her older brother William had lasted until the first snows, before a rattlesnake bite a freak occurrence in the cold had turned his blood to fire and then to ice. Now it was just Eliza May. She was leaner than she had been the soft edges of her youth, carved away by grief and hard labor, leaving behind the resilient grain of a survivor. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, was braided tightly to keep it from her face. Her hands, though chapped and scarred, moved with an economy of motion that spoke of endless chores, splitting wood-setting snares, tending the fire-kneading dough. This morning, the wind had a new voice. It wasn't the usual howl. It was a mournful, keening sound that slipped through the daubing in the logs and danced with the flames in her stone fireplace. She pulled her father's heavy wool coat tighter around her shoulders and peered through the small, greased paper window. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white. Visibility was no more than 20 yards. Her snares set down by the creek would have to wait. To venture out in this whiteout was to risk becoming another frozen marker in the unforgiving landscape. She spent the morning reinforcing the shelter for her lone, milking cow, Bess, and the 2 chickens that were her only other living companions. The work was hard, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the lean-to, but it was honest. It kept the blood moving and the despair at bay. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. By midday the wind began to relent. The sky remained a solid, bruised-looking grey, but the world stopped moving. The silence that returned was profound, the kind that made the crunch of her own boots in the snow sound like a gunshot. She decided to risk checking the nearest snares. A rabbit would mean a warm meal that wasn't just salted pork and dried beans. She strapped on the snowshoes her father had made their webbed frames, feeling like familiar extensions of her own feet. The rifle, a well-oiled Winchester .73 that had been William's pride and joy, felt heavy and comforting in her mittened hands. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the landscape, not just for the snares, but for the ripple of movement that might mean a wolf or worse, a mountain cat, drawn by the scent of her small homestead. The creek was a ribbon of black, churning water, cutting through the white, its banks heaped with snowdrifts, sculpted by the wind. She found the first snare empty, the second one too. It was at the third, nestled in a thicket of willows, that she saw it. At first her mind refused to process the image. It was a bundle of some kind partially buried in a fresh drift, a splash of unnatural colour against the stark white. The colour was a deep, rich turquoise, the shade of a summer sky. She thought perhaps a blanket or a saddlebag had been dropped by a passing rider, though who would be fool enough to travel in that storm was beyond her. She approached slowly, rifle at the ready. The plains were a tinderbox of tension between the settlers, the miners, and the Ute and Navajo tribes whose ancestral lands this was. Her father had preached caution, but not hatred. They were here first, Eliza May, he'd always said. We're just guests on their land, whether the government in Washington says so or not. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't just a blanket. It was a small human form, wrapped in a deerskin bundle adorned with turquoise beads. A child. Her heart seized in her chest. She scrambled forward, dropping to her knees in the snow. She brushed the powder away from a face, the color of polished copper lips, a frightening shade of blue. It was a toddler, no more than 2 or 3 years old. A boy with a mop of straight black hair dusted with ice crystals. His eyes were closed, his small chest still. For a terrible moment, she thought he was dead. Then she saw it, a tiny faint puff of vapor from his nostrils, a ghost of a breath against the frozen air. He was alive. Every instinct screamed at her. This was a Navajo child. Taking him was borrowing a world of trouble. His people would come looking. They would see her a lone white woman with their missing son, and they would not ask questions. They would assume the worst. They would assume theft, kidnapping. Her father's cautionary words echoed in her mind, but they were drowned out by the image of her own mother's face, pale and still in the firelight. She could not leave a child to die. It wasn't in her. With a grunt, she scooped the boy into her arms. He was terrifyingly light, a fragile weight that spoke of a life on the very edge of being extinguished. The deerskin was stiff with ice. Cradling him against her chest, shielding him from the wind, she turned and began the desperate, heart-pounding journey back to the cabin, each footstep a prayer, the heavy silence of the valley now ringing with the frantic beat of her own heart. The world had just shrunk to the size of this freezing child in her arms. The cabin door slammed shut behind her, a punctuation mark on the desperate flight from the creek. The warmth inside was a physical shock after the biting cold. Eliza May didn't waste a second. She laid the small boy on the bearskin rug before the hearth, his little body looking achingly out of place in her rustic home. Her hands, clumsy with urgency, and cold, worked at the frozen thongs of his deerskin wrappings. Layer by layer, she peeled them away, an outer layer of hide, a beautifully woven blanket of red and black wool, and finally, a soft doeskin tunic and leggings. His skin was icy to the touch, a pale, mottled grey that terrified her. He was so still, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, her own breath catching in her throat. "Don't you die on me. Not here. Not now." Her mind, sharpened by a year of solitary survival, raced through a checklist of necessities. Warmth. Gentle, gradual warmth. To heat him too quickly would be a shock to his system. Her father had always warned about frostbite. She stripped off his frozen clothes and her own wet outer layers, then wrapped him in the driest, softest wool blanket she owned. Sitting on the rug, she pulled him onto her lap, tucking him against her chest and wrapping another thick quilt around them both. She was sharing her own body heat, a desperate, primal act of transference. His skin felt like cold marble against hers. She began to rub his tiny limbs, her hands firm but gentle working to stimulate the circulation. His feet were like blocks of ice. His hands were curled into tight, frozen fists. She rubbed and rubbed, murmuring nonsense words of comfort, the same soft sounds her mother had used to soothe her childhood fevers. "There now, little one. You're safe. You're warm now. Just a little longer." Hours blurred together. She fed the fire stick by stick, keeping it a steady, radiant heat. She lost all sense of time, her world reduced to the rise and fall of her own chest, and the desperate hope she could feel his begin to strengthen. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. The frightening bluish tint around his lips began to recede, replaced by a pale but more natural color. The mottling on his skin lessened. She felt a faint tremor run through his body, a shudder that was not from cold, but from life reasserting itself. With a surge of relief that almost made her weep, she felt his small body go from icy to cool, and then, finally, to lukewarm. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was deepening, becoming more regular. Now for the next challenge, hydration and nourishment. She couldn't force liquid down his throat. She laid him back on the bearskin, propping his head up with a pillow, and went to her stores. She had a small amount of honey and some dried herbs. She brewed a weak, lukewarm tea with a touch of chamomile and sweetened it with a drop of precious honey. Dipping the corner of a clean rag into the liquid, she gently squeezed a single drop onto his lips. He didn't respond. She tried again. His lips parted slightly, a purely reflexive action. She persisted, drop by patient drop for what felt like another hour. Eventually, she saw a faint swallowing motion in his throat. It was a victory as great as any she had ever known. As twilight painted the snowy landscape in shades of purple and deep blue, the boy's eyelids flickered. Eliza May held her breath. His eyes opened. They were the darkest, deepest brown she had ever seen, clouded with confusion and fear. He let out a weak, mewling cry, a sound that tore at her heart. "Shh, shh. It's all right," she crooned, stroking his hair. "You're safe." He was too weak to struggle, but his eyes followed her every move wide with an animal terror. She was a stranger. Her face was pale, her hair light, her cabin filled with smells that were utterly alien to him. He was a captive in a foreign land. Over the next 2 days, a fragile routine was established. She called him Ashkie, the Navajo word for boy that she'd heard a trader use once. It felt more respectful than giving him a name of her own. She fed him thinned broth and honeyed water, first from the rag and then from a small spoon. She spoke to him in a low, constant murmur, not caring that he couldn't understand her words, only hoping he would understand the gentle tone. He remained silent and watchful. He wouldn't make a sound except to cry out in his sleep, his small hands clenching at the blankets. She saw the intricate silver and turquoise bracelet on his tiny wrist, a piece of craftsmanship that spoke of a family that loved him, a family that was surely searching for him, grieving him. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind sounded like hoofbeats. His people, the Dine as they called themselves, were not known for their gentle treatment of those who wronged them. They would see her rifle, her solitary existence, and this child in her care, and they would draw their own conclusions. Yet as she watched Ashkie sleep by the fire on the 3rd night, his small face finally relaxed in the flickering light, a different feeling began to bloom in her chest. It was a fierce, protective warmth she hadn't felt since her family was alive. This small, silent child had in the space of 3 days brought life back into her empty home. He had filled the crushing silence with the sound of his breathing, with the weight of his presence. He had given her someone to care for, other than herself. She sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, watching the flames dance. She was caught in an impossible trap. To keep him was to invite a war she could not win. To take him out and try to find his people in this wilderness was to risk them both freezing to death. She could only wait. Wait for the snow to clear. Wait for the world to find her. And as she rocked, she prayed that when it did, it would come with mercy. A week passed. The great storm of 75 gave way to a period of brutal, windless cold under a sky of blinding blue. The snowpack froze solid, a crust of ice covering the deep powder. Inside the cabin, a tentative peace had settled. Ashki had regained much of his strength. He was walking now, exploring the small one-room world with a toddler's solemn curiosity. He would touch the rough-hewn wooden table, stare into the flames of the fire, and watch Eliza May with his dark, unblinking eyes. He still had not spoken a word. The only sounds he made were soft humming noises as he played with the wooden bird she had carved for him. The bond between them was forged in silence, in shared meals of stew and cornbread, in the nightly ritual of her tucking him into a small bed she had made from a crate, and soft furs near the hearth. For the first time in a year, Eliza May felt something other than the sharp ache of loneliness. It was a terrifying and wonderful feeling. She knew it was a borrowed peace. Every morning she climbed the snowy rise behind her cabin and scanned the vast white expanse of the valley. She was looking for smoke signals for riders, for any sign of his people. Nothing. The world was still and empty. The morning of the 8th day broke clear and cold. The air was so still she could hear the snap of a twig in the forest 100 yards away. It was that unnatural stillness that first put her on edge. As she was ladling porridge into 2 bowls, Bess, her cow, let out a low, distressed moo from the lean-to. The chickens began to cackle in alarm. Eliza May froze the spoon hovering over the bowl. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She moved to the door, grabbing the Winchester from its pegs. She scooped up a terrified Ashki, who immediately clung to her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. His small body was trembling. He knew. She cracked the door and peered out. They were there. At the edge of the clearing, where the trees gave way to her small homestead, a line of riders sat upon their horses. They were motionless, like statues carved from the winter itself. 10-20, she couldn't count them all. They wore sheepskin coats and blankets of bold geometric patterns. Their breath and the breath of their mounts plumed in the frigid air. They were armed with rifles and bows. They were Navajo warriors, and their presence was overwhelming, an undeniable statement of power. At their center sat a man who was clearly their leader. He was older, his face a mask of stern, weathered lines. But he sat straighter than any of them, a long rifle held across the pommel of his saddle. A single eagle feather was tied in his long, grey-streaked black hair. His gaze was fixed on her cabin, intense and piercing, as if he could see through the logs and into her very soul. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Eliza May. This was it. The moment she had dreaded. They had found her. Her mind raced. She could bar the door, try to fight. It would be suicide. A single woman against dozens of seasoned warriors. They would burn her out before she could fire a second shot. There was only one path, to face them. Holding Ashki tight, she whispered, "It's all right, little bird. It's all right." She took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold hit her face. She stood straight, the rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. She made sure her other arm was wrapped protectively around the boy, his face still hidden in her neck. It was her only card to play. She was his protector, not his captor. The leader's eyes narrowed his gaze, locking onto the small boy in her arms. A low murmur rippled through the line of warriors. The leader dismounted in a single fluid motion. He handed his reins to the man beside him and began to walk toward her. He moved not with aggression, but with an immense, unhurried authority. The snow crunched under his moccasins, the only sound in the vast silence. Eliza May's heart hammered against her ribs. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rifle stock. He stopped about 15 feet from her porch, his dark eyes never leaving hers. They were filled with a complex storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher: grief, anger, suspicion, and something else. A desperate, searching hope. He spoke, and his voice was deep and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. His words were in his native tongue, Dine Bizard. She didn't understand them, but the meaning was clear. He was asking about the boy. She swallowed her throat dry. I don't understand. He paused, studying her face. Then he spoke again, this time in accented, but clear English. The child. Where did you find him? By the creek, she said, her voice trembling slightly. In the snow, after the storm. He was nearly frozen. I brought him here. I kept him warm. The chief's eyes moved from her face to the boy who finally peeked out from her shoulder. At the sight of the man, Ashki's eyes went wide. A small, choked sound escaped his lips. Atsili, the chief's stern mask crumbled. A look of profound, heart-wrenching relief washed over his features. He took a half-step forward, his hand outstretched. Ashki! He breathed the name, a prayer. He looked back at Eliza May, his eyes now shining with unshed tears. He calls me my younger father. I am Hastin Yazi. He is my son. Relief so potent it made her dizzy washed over Eliza May. This was his father. Hastin took another step. May I? She nodded, and slowly she knelt down, allowing Ashki to slide from her arms. The boy hesitated for only a second before running on his unsteady legs into his father's embrace. Hastin swept him up, burying his face in his son's hair, murmuring to him in their language. The warriors behind him remained still, but the tension that had radiated from them seemed to dissolve into the cold air. They were not witnessing a confrontation. They were witnessing a reunion. After a long moment, Hastin Yazi looked at Eliza May, his son still held tight in his arms. His expression was one of deep, solemn gratitude. You saved the son of my spirit. You saved my heir. He would have died, she said simply. I couldn't let him die. My hunting party was separated in the blizzard, Hastin explained, his voice thick with emotion. His mother was with him. We found her 2 days ago. The cold, it took her. A fresh wave of sorrow washed over Eliza May for the boy, for this grieving man. We tracked him for days. Hastin continued. We feared the worst. A wolf, the freezing, or a white man looking for a bounty. His eyes bored into hers. We did not expect to find a lone woman with a warm fire. He gestured to his men. Several dismounted and came forward, leading 4 magnificent horses. They were not the wiry mustangs many of the tribes rode. They were strong, well-bred animals, their coats shining even in the winter light. 2 were laden with heavy bundles. My debt to you is great, Hastin said, his voice regaining its formal authority. It cannot be paid with trinkets. I offer these horses. They will help you plow, hunt, and travel. The furs will keep you warm through many winters. It was a gift of immense value, more than she could ever have imagined. Thank you, she said, overwhelmed. You don't have to. It is not enough." He cut her off, his gaze unwavering. "A life for a life. My son lives because of you, but this land is changing. It is not safe for a woman alone. My warriors saw your tracks, but another man could have as well. A man with less honor." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Your life is now tied to mine. Your safety is my concern. This is my proposal. You will be under my protection. My warriors will watch this valley. They will hunt for you. You will want for nothing. No man, white or Navajo, will dare to harm you." Eliza May was stunned into silence. It wasn't a proposal of marriage or servitude. It was a proposal of alliance. A chieftain of the Diné was offering his protection, his resources, to a lone white settler. It was an arrangement that defied every rule of this harsh and divided land. It would make her an outcast among her own people, and a curiosity at best among his. But as she looked at the vast, lonely wilderness around her, she knew he was right. She was vulnerable, a single spark in a world of ice and predators. "You would do this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The life of my son is a debt of honor, Hastine." Yazi said, his voice resonating with the finality of a king's decree. "I will not see it repaid with your death. We are now bound, you and I. Accept my proposal, and this valley will be the safest place in all the territories for you. Refuse, and you remain alone." The world changed the moment she accepted. With a simple quiet, "I accept," Eliza May Thompson sealed a pact that was as invisible and as powerful as the winter wind. Chief Hastine Yazi gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. He spoke in rapid Diné to his warriors. The men who had brought the horses and furs laid the goods respectfully near her porch, their movements efficient and silent. They left the 4 horses tethered to her corral, their warm breath mingling with Bess's in the frigid air. Hastine held Ashki in one arm, and with his free hand, he gently touched the silver and turquoise bracelet on his son's wrist. He then looked at Eliza May. "He is my son," he said again, as if to reaffirm the fact for himself. "But for a week, he was yours. He will not forget the woman who saved him." He turned without another word, mounted his horse with the boy seated before him, and led his warriors away. They vanished back into the trees as silently as they had appeared, leaving Eliza May standing in a world that was both the same and irrevocably different. The 4 horses were a constant living reminder of the new reality. They were strong and healthy, a veritable fortune in this part of the country. The furs were thick and luxurious enough to last a lifetime. But the true change was less tangible. It was the feeling of being watched. She never saw them, not clearly, but she knew they were there. A flicker of movement at the tree line, a single misplaced raven's call that sounded too much like a signal, a set of fresh tracks not hers near the spring in the morning. Hastine's warriors were a ghost patrol, a silent testament to their chief's promise. At first it was unnerving. The feeling of unseen eyes made the hair on her neck stand up. She felt like a specimen under glass. But as days turned into a week, the feeling shifted from fear to a strange sense of security. The predatory silence of the valley was gone, replaced by a guarded quiet. When she went to check her snares, she found a freshly killed deer lying near the path, its throat expertly cut. Another day, a stack of perfectly split firewood, far more than she could have chopped herself, appeared by her woodshed. They were providing for her just as Hastine had said. She was no longer entirely alone, but she was in a new kind of isolation. She was a white woman, living under the protection of a Navajo chief. In the eyes of any prospector or trapper who might wander into her valley, she would be at best a curiosity. At worst, a turncoat, a squaw man's woman. She belonged nowhere. It was this thought that occupied her mind one afternoon as she mended a shirt by the fire. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the approaching rider until his horse's snort broke the stillness. Her heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the Winchester, her motions now instinctive. It wasn't Navajo. The rider was white on a scrawny-looking roan, and he was leading a pack mule. He was a prospector by the looks of him, with a grizzled beard, a dirty slouch hat, and mean little eyes that scanned her cabin and property with a covetous gleam. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. He stopped his horse a respectable distance away, but his eyes were disrespectful, roving over her from head to toe. "Name's Bartholomew Corrigan. Bart to my friends." "What do you want?" Eliza May asked, her tone flat and cold. She did not lower the rifle. Corrigan's eyes flickered to the 4 fine horses in her corral, then back to her. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. "Just passing through, seeing the lay of the land. Mighty fine valley you got here. A bit lonely for a pretty thing like yourself, though, ain't it?" "I do just fine," she said. His smile widened, showing stained teeth. "I'll bet you do. I'll bet you do. Got some fine horseflesh there. A woman alone with horses like that. You must have a wealthy benefactor." His gaze was pointed and insulting. He had clearly heard rumors or was drawing his own ugly conclusions. "My business is my own," she said, her grip tightening on the Winchester. "This is private land. You're trespassing." "Now hold on, missy," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need for hostilities. I'm just a friendly neighbor, looking to be neighborly." He squinted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I've been watching this valley for a while, from the ridge over yonder." A chill went down Eliza May's spine. He had been spying on her. How long had he been there? Had he seen Hastine's visit, saw your visitors the other week? He continued, confirming her fear. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "A whole passel of 'em. Red savages. Risky business dealing with their kind. They're treacherous. Smile to your face and scalp you in your sleep." "They were just passing through." Eliza May lied, her face a stony mask. Corrigan chuckled a nasty, knowing sound. "Sure they were, and they just happened to leave behind 4 prime horses and a winter's worth of furs. You must be a hell of a trader, ma'am." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Or maybe the chief took a special liking to you. Heard they do that. Take a white woman to their camps." The insult was as sharp as a slap. Rage, hot and pure, burned in her chest. "Get off my land," she said, her voice low and dangerous. She raised the rifle just a fraction of an inch. For a moment, Corrigan's ugly smile faltered. He saw something in her eyes that gave him pause. He was a bully, used to intimidating people, but he wasn't a fool. He knew when he'd pushed too far for now. All right, he said, pulling on his reins. "I'm going. But you mark my words. This land is too good for one woman, and it's sure as hell too good for the likes of them savages. The railroad's coming, the army's coming. Things are gonna change round here. You'd be wise to pick the right side." He turned his horse and mule and trotted away, but not before casting one last, long, greedy look at her property. Eliza May stood there, her heart pounding, long after he had disappeared into the trees. The encounter left a foul taste in her mouth. Bart Corrigan was more than just a passing nuisance. He was the face of the encroaching world, a world of greed, prejudice, and violence. He had seen her wealth, and he had seen what he believed was her weakness, and he had seen her connection to the Navajo not as a shield, but as a stain, an offense to be punished. That night, the protection of Hastine's warriors felt different. It was no longer a cage, but a necessary fortress wall. And for the first time, Eliza May understood that the greatest threat to her life wasn't the winter or the wilderness, but the men who looked like her, men like Bart Corrigan. Bart Corrigan became a lingering poison in the valley. He didn't leave. He set up a crude, filthy camp on the far ridge, just outside the boundary of what Eliza May considered her land, but close enough for his presence to be a constant looming threat. He was a vulture, circling, waiting for an opportunity. The first incident was small, designed to test the waters. One morning, she found the top rail of her corral fence broken, the horses spooked, but thankfully still contained. It could have been a deer, but she knew it wasn't. It was a message. I can get to what is yours. A few days later, her best snare was stolen, the rabbit it held taken along with it. It was a petty theft, but it was another violation, another reminder that he was watching, probing her defenses. She felt his eyes on her when she collected water from the creek, when she chopped wood, when she tended to her small winter garden under its protective glass pane. Her unseen guardians were aware of him too. She could feel it. The quiet in the woods seemed more charged, more alert. Once, while walking near the edge of her clearing, she found a single distinctive arrow stuck in a tree pointed directly toward Corrigan's ridge. It was a Navajo arrow fletched with hawk feathers. It was another message, this one not for her, but for him. We see you. This silent three-way war of nerves continued for 2 weeks. Corrigan was biding his time, growing bolder. Eliza May was growing more weary, her sleep plagued by nightmares of his greasy smile and greedy eyes. The situation came to a head on a fiercely cold afternoon. Eliza May was returning from the rise where her parents were buried, a small bundle of pine boughs in her hand to lay on their graves when she saw him. Corrigan was standing in her clearing, not 20 yards from her front door. He wasn't alone. He had 2 other men with him, men of the same rough-hewn, desperate sort. They were looking at her cabin, at her horses, their expressions a mixture of avarice and contempt. Eliza May stopped dead in her tracks, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol she had started wearing on her hip. The Winchester was inside the cabin. A foolish mistake. Corrigan saw her and grinned. Well, look what the cat dragged in. We was just admiring your setup, little lady. Mighty impressive. I told you to get off my land, Corrigan, she said, her voice steely. Now that's the thing, he said, taking a step toward her. According to the territorial surveyor I talked to in Durango, this whole valley ain't registered to no one. It's unclaimed land, open for filing, and I aim to file. My father built that cabin with his own hands. She shot back, her blood running cold. We settled this land. Settlin' ain't ownin', one of Corrigan's companions sneered. Not without the proper paperwork. And a woman alone can't hold a claim like this. It ain't right. So we're making you an offer, Corrigan said, his eyes gleaming. A generous one. We'll give you one of them fine horses and enough supplies to get you to the nearest town. You walk away and we don't have to get unpleasant. It was a land grab, pure and simple. They saw a vulnerable woman and a prime piece of property, and they were going to take it. Her alliance with the Navajo had not deterred them. It had provoked them. In their twisted minds, she had forfeited her right to be treated as one of their own. I'm not going anywhere, Eliza May said, her voice shaking with a rage that eclipsed her fear. This is my home. Corrigan's smile vanished. Wrong answer. See, we figure you're nothing but a savage lover, an Injun's whore. You don't deserve this land. We're taking it, and we're taking them horses as payment for the trouble. He took another step, and his friends fanned out, their intentions clear. They were going to corner her, to overpower her. She was one woman against 3 armed men. Suddenly a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the cold air from behind her. "She is not alone." Eliza May gasped and spun around. Hastine Yazzie stood not 10 feet away, having emerged from the aspen grove as silently as a shadow. He was not dressed for a hunt. He was dressed for war. A band of turquoise-colored paint was slashed across his eyes, and he held a rifle in one hand and a war axe in the other. Behind him, emerging from the trees on all sides, were his warriors. 10, then 20, then more, all armed, all painted their faces, grim and resolute. They moved with a terrifying silence surrounding the clearing, cutting off all escape for Corrigan and his men. Corrigan and his cronies froze their faces, draining of color. Their blustering bravado evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. They had walked into a trap not of Eliza May's making, but of the chief's. "This is her land," Hastine said, his English cold and precise. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Corrigan. "She is under the protection of the Diné. You have trespassed. You have threatened her. You have forfeited your lives." "Now wait a minute." Corrigan stammered, his hands raised. "This ain't got nothing to do with you. This is white folks' business." "She saved my son," Hastine stated, as if it were the only law that mattered in the universe. "Her business is my business. Her enemies are my enemies." The warriors raised their rifles and drew their bows, the sound of bowstrings being pulled taut, a low, ominous hum in the winter air. Corrigan's friends looked at each other in panic, ready to bolt. "I want them gone," Eliza May said, her voice ringing out with newfound strength. She looked at Hastine, then at Corrigan, her fear burned away by a cold fury. "I don't want their blood on my land. I just want them gone, forever." Hastine considered her words, then gave a sharp nod. He barked an order in Diné. The warriors did not lower their weapons, but they held their position. "The woman shows you a mercy you do not deserve," Hastine said to Corrigan. "Leave your horses, your mule, and your guns. Take only the food you can carry. Walk out of this valley and do not return. If my scouts ever see your faces in these mountains again, they will not wait for my command." Corrigan stared, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. To be stripped of his horse and gun in the middle of winter was a death sentence, just a slower one. But looking at the sea of grim Navajo faces and the forest of weapons pointed at him, he knew it was the only choice he had. Without a word, he and his men unbuckled their gun belts and let them drop to the snow. They unloaded their supplies, taking only a few bags of food. Then, humiliated and defeated, they began the long, cold walk out of the valley. Eliza May stood watching them go, the pistol still clutched in her hand. Hastine stood beside her, a silent, powerful presence. The threat was gone, but the confrontation had changed something. The line between her world and his had been crossed. She had not just been protected by him, she had stood with him. And in doing so, she had made her choice. She had picked her side. The departure of Corrigan and his men did not bring peace. It brought a tense, waiting silence. Eliza May knew men like him. Humiliation was not a lesson to them. It was fuel. A man stripped of his pride and his property in the wilderness would either die or return with vengeance. Hastine knew this as well. He did not withdraw his warriors. Instead, their presence became more visible. 2 sentries were now constantly posted on the ridges overlooking the valley, their dark forms silhouetted against the sky at dawn and dusk. They were no longer just watching over her. They were guarding a border against an inevitable attack. A week later, Hastine himself returned, not with a large party, but with 2 of his most trusted men. He dismounted before her cabin, his face etched with concern. "He will be back," Hastine said without preamble. "A man like that feeds on hatred. He will go to the mining camps or the forts. He will tell them a story of a white woman captured by savages, a story they will want to believe. He will gather others." "What can we do?" Eliza May asked, her stomach twisting into a knot. "Tonight is the full moon, the moon of the popping trees," he said, using the traditional name for the deep winter moon. "The cold will be at its fiercest. They will think we are in our winter camps, huddled by our fires. They will use the bright snow to travel by night. They will come tonight." His certainty was chilling. "How do you know?" "I know his kind," Hastine said grimly. "His pride is a fire that will not let him feel the cold. He will want the cover of darkness, but he will not be able to wait." The plan was laid out with stark simplicity. Eliza May would not remain in the cabin. It was a wooden box, a trap. She would come with him to a sheltered cave in the cliffs overlooking the valley entrance. From there they could watch. His warriors would be hidden in the trees, a reception committee for Corrigan's return. As dusk fell, painting the snow in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, Eliza May packed a small bundle water, some dried meat and extra ammunition for her rifle. Leaving her home even for a night felt like a surrender, but she trusted Hastine's judgment. He led her along with his 2 warriors up a steep hidden path to the cave. The vantage point was perfect. They could see the entire valley floor laid out below them, her small cabin looking like a child's toy in the vastness. As the moon rose huge and white, it cast an ethereal blue-tinged light over the landscape, illuminating everything with a ghostly clarity. They waited in silence, the cold biting deep. The hours ticked by. One of the warriors shared a thick fur blanket, with her a gesture of camaraderie that went beyond words. This was no longer about a debt. They were allies facing a common enemy. Just after midnight they saw them. A group of riders, maybe 10 or 12, picking their way carefully into the valley. They were led by a man on a big bay horse, a man who sat in his saddle with a familiar, hateful slump. Bart Corrigan. He had brought an army. "They mean to burn you out," Hastine whispered, his voice a low growl. "See the torches." Several of the men carried them unlit for now. Their plan was obvious: surround the cabin, set it ablaze, and shoot anyone who tried to run out. It was a slaughter, not a land claim. Eliza May's hands tightened on her rifle. Her home, her parents' graves, everything she had left in the world was down there. A cold, hard resolve settled in her heart. Corrigan had made this personal. Hastine gave a low whistle, a perfect imitation of a nighthawk's call. It was the signal. Down below, Corrigan's party, dismounted at the edge of the clearing, moving with what they thought was stealth. They began to spread out, encircling the cabin. Corrigan himself struck a match, its flare a tiny spark of malevolence in the moonlight, and lit a torch. "Let's smoke the traitor out!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the still cold air. As he raised the torch to throw it, the night exploded. An arrow fletched with black feathers hissed out of the darkness and buried itself in Corrigan's torch arm. He screamed, dropping the flame into the snow where it sputtered and died. From every direction, the forest erupted in gunfire. Hastine's warriors, perfectly positioned, fired a devastating volley. 2 of Corrigan's men fell before they even knew what was happening. The rest scattered, firing wildly into the trees, their surprise turning instantly to panic. From the cave, Hastine raised his rifle. He did not fire into the melee. His eyes were fixed on one man. "The serpent's head," he murmured. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean, perfect. Bart Corrigan spun around, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, and fell face first into the snow. Eliza May found her own target. One of the men was taking cover behind her woodpile, aiming toward a thicket where she knew 2 warriors were hidden. She rested her Winchester on the rock ledge, took a steadying breath, just as her father had taught her, and fired. The man cried out and clutched his leg, his own rifle clattering to the ground. The fight was short and brutal. Corrigan's party, leaderless and caught in a perfectly executed ambush, had no chance. Some tried to flee back the way they came, only to be cut down by warriors waiting in reserve. Others threw down their weapons and begged for their lives. Within 10 minutes, it was over. The silence that descended was more profound than before, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Hastine led the way down from the cliffs. The scene in the clearing was grim. The moonlight shone on the dark shapes in the snow. His warriors were already moving among them, collecting weapons. The surviving raiders, 4 of them, were rounded up, their faces pale with terror. Hastine strode to the body of Bart Corrigan and nudged it with his foot. He looked at Eliza May, his face illuminated by the cold moonlight. The serpent is dead. The venom is gone from this valley. Eliza May looked at the chaos, at the blood staining the pristine snow around her home. This violence, this death had been brought to her doorstep. But she had not cowered. She had not hidden. She had stood with Hastine and his people. She had fought to defend her home and the honor of their alliance. Hastine spoke to his warriors, who began to deal with the aftermath, tending to the few wounded on their side and securing the prisoners. He then turned back to Eliza May, his gaze soft. "You have the heart of a warrior, Eliza May Thompson," he said, using her full name for the first time. "You did not shrink from the fire." She looked at her hands, which were steady, and then at her cabin, which was safe. "It was my home," she said. "You helped me defend it." "No," he corrected her gently. "We defended our home. This valley is yours. Your fight is ours. That was the proposal. Tonight you sealed it in fire and blood." He reached out, not to touch her, but as a gesture of respect, his hand hovering in the space between them. "Tonight you are Dine." The dawn that followed the battle was stark and quiet. After the grim work of clearing the valley was done, Hastine found Eliza May on the rise, standing before the 2 simple crosses that marked her parents' graves. The violence of the night had passed, leaving a profound stillness in its wake. "My debt to you is repaid," Hastine said, his voice low as he stood beside her. "Your home is secure. The story of this night will travel. No one will trouble you again." His words signaled an end to their arrangement. He could ride away, their contract fulfilled, leaving her in the safety he had promised. The thought, which should have been a comfort, left an unexpected hollowness in her chest. The silence she had once fought to endure now felt like a void she did not wish to re-enter. "What will you do now?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I will take my son to his mother's people, so he may heal," Hastine replied. He then turned to her. "And you, Eliza May Thompson, what will you do with your peace?" "I will survive," she said simply. "It is what I have always done." "Survival is not living," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers. He had come to her valley for his son, but had found something more. "The proposal I made before was born of honor, a payment of a debt. Now that debt is paid, I come to you with a new proposal, not as a chief to a settler, but as a man to a woman." He took a step closer, the space between them charged with the weight of all they had endured. "My wife is gone. My son is without a mother. I have seen how you cared for him, and I have seen the warrior's heart you possess. I do not ask you to leave this home you fought for. I ask you to let me and my son share it. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch both a question and a promise. Let us build a family from our sorrows. Let this valley be a bridge between our peoples, not a border. Marry me, Eliza May Thompson, not for protection, but for a future. Tears blurred her vision. He was offering her not a shield, but a partner, a life. She thought of the crushing loneliness that had defined her existence, and then of the fierce belonging she'd felt fighting beside him. Her past was here in the cold ground, but her future stood before her, offering a shared horizon. A genuine hopeful smile touched her lips for the first time in a year. "My name is Eliza May," she said softly, her hand tightening around his. "And yes, Hastine Yazzie. Yes, I will." The story of Eliza May Thompson and Chief Hastine Yazzie became a quiet legend in the high country, a tale not of conflict, but of connection. It's a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, in times of deep division and prejudice, the courage of one person can build a bridge between two worlds. Theirs was a family born not of convenience, but of mutual respect, forged in the crucible of a brutal winter and sealed by a promise of a shared future. It reminds us that humanity and love can be found in the most unexpected of places, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are not the lands we claim, but the bonds we build. If this story of courage, survival, and unexpected love resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of the Old West that go beyond simple shootouts. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dramatic, true-to-life stories that shaped the American frontier. Thank you for listening.